Now available in paperback and e-readers, John Haynes' Godbreaker. The man who rules the world takes on the Asgardian god of thunder in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get your copy of John Haynes' Godbreaker in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. There's a disturbing trend in comics, science fiction, and fantasy that I have a real issue with. Now, over the last couple of years, the comic book industry and those who produce superhero films have been producing content to try to make us sympathetic to villains and try to make us believe that the villain has some sort of justification for whatever unethical behavior they participate in. Now, most recently, back in 2018, we started to see this trend enter into mainstream media with the movie Avengers Infinity War. And as the Marvel Studios released Avengers Infinity War, they wrote the film to be sympathetic to the villain Thanos in his quest to get the Infinity Stones to murder half of the universe. And as this film went and became a blockbuster, we started to see people on social media starting to go out and be sympathetic to Thanos' cause, and many people posting up memes saying that Thanos was right. And when I saw those memes, I saw it as a very troubling and disturbing trend that came out of many of the comics of the 1980s that basically started to become mainstreamed. And this whole trend is a troubling one because if you're sympathetic to the villain, then there's clearly a problem with our society. Now, most recently, we started to see this trend continue to escalate over at Marvel when they released their X-Men 97 series. And as they released their X-Men 97 series, they then were promoting a narrative regarding the villain Magneto, saying that Magneto was right as related to looking to make mutants separate from humanity, and say that Charles Xavier's dream of mutants and humans working together was something that was completely unattainable by saying tolerance is extinction. Now, this whole talking point, again, is looked to make us sympathetic to the villain and make us sympathetic to the villain and their cause. And I find that to be, again, a very disturbing trend that's becoming more and more mainstreamed as related to trying to take superhero ethics out of the world of black and white and push it further into this dark gray area, a dark gray area that puts us in a very bad place as related to humanity. Now, this whole trend of putting superheroes in the gray area started with Alan Moore's Watchmen, a comic that was basically a commentary on what not to do with superheroes. And basically, in Alan Moore's Watchmen, he took superheroes that were inspired by the Charlton comics into the gray area, and those characters basically did whatever they pleased without ever thinking about good or evil whatsoever or the consequences of their actions. No, their whole idea was that because they had power, they could do whatever they wanted for the quote-unquote greater good without having any sort of regard for the people in that world. And with Watchmen, most of those so-called heroes were disconnected and detached from the people that they say they were looking to protect. And since they were disconnected and detached from people, what they did was just whatever they pleased. I mean, you had Dr. Manhattan, who just basically didn't even see people around him or cared about them. You had Silk Spectre and Owlman just basically participating in wanton violence. You had Rorschach, who had no regard for human life as long as he got what he wanted. And then you had Ozymandias, who basically had no regard for human life to the point where he was doing things for his idea of the greater good and basically was willing to put the lives of millions of people in jeopardy and led to the deaths of over 8 million people, all based on his theory as related to facts and figures. Again, complete detachment from people. And as many people read Watchmen, they basically started to incorporate their ideas into mainstream comics. And as they incorporated those ideas into mainstream comics, this is where we got stories like Infinity Gauntlet, and we got all of these stories like The Fatal Attractions. Again, these were stories that were adapted into movies like Infinity War and X-Men 97, and as they were adapted and made for the screen, this is where we've got people believing that characters who are bad guys like Thanos and Magneto are right. And it clearly shows how we basically have our sense of right and wrong completely twisted. And completely twisted because people really did not understand the commentary that Alan Moore was making with Watchmen, and didn't understand that what he was saying in Watchmen was basically, you don't want to see your heroes become like this. But sadly, over the last 35 to 40 years, our superheroes are not acting like heroes anymore, and not acting like heroes anymore because they're sympathetic to villains, and we're becoming more and more as an audience sympathetic to the villain and their cause. Because when I look at comics, again, and science fiction and fantasy, if you're getting sympathetic to the villain, then clearly the creator has done something wrong, because the villain is somebody who does not follow boundaries, does not look to preserve good at all, and does not want to stand for what's right. No, when they go out here talking about doing wrong for a greater good, basically they're looking to compromise their ethics to achieve whatever goals that they want without regard for any of the people who they say that they're looking out for. That's the whole thing with the identifying with a bad guy. The whole thing is the bad guy isn't looking to do what's right. No, the bad guy is looking to do what's right for them, not for other people. And that's what makes all of this being sympathetic to the villain a very dangerous thing to put in media. A very dangerous thing, because you have people being sympathetic to someone who wants to do what they say is the greater good, but what they want to do is be able to create a covert contract where they can break the rules and then tell you you have to follow the rules, but they make it where there is no rule for them, but they want rules for everybody else. And again, that's where you have the whole thing that I'm seeing with this trend. First, you got people identifying with Thanos, saying it's okay for him to kill half the universe, and he's justified in that because there's not enough resources. He's justified in taking lives of people. But if you have power, like Stan Lee says in the Spider-Man comics, you have this great power, and you have a great responsibility to use that power to help others, because in that classic amazing fantasy, what Stan Lee was presenting was, yes, Peter Parker had great power, but because he let the burglar get away, because he was in his feelings about doing what was right for himself, this basically led to him having to deal with the consequence of his Uncle Ben winding up dying. And that's where Peter Parker realized there was a line between good and evil. That's where Peter Parker realized that there was a line between good and evil, and right and wrong. And if you have great power, you have a responsibility to go out here and do what is right, even though you're not going to get a benefit, because if you don't do what is right, it basically makes it where you're going to have to eventually deal with a consequence. And those who are sympathetic to the bad guy, what's going to happen is you're eventually going to have to deal with a consequence, because when you identify with a villain, basically what's going to happen is you're going to be in a place where you're going to have to be jammed up because you went along with whatever I want for the greater good. And that's the whole message that I find to be very bad about most of these modern interpretations of comics in film and television that come out of many of those 80s and 90s comics. I mean, what we're getting is people being taught, oh, do whatever you have to because you believe it is right, not understanding there's a clear line between right and wrong as related to a hero and a villain. And when I see people putting up things like the memes that Magneto was right and Thanos is right, it really shows how twisted American values have become as related to good and evil. Because what I see with the whole values of America, it's become really twisted. I mean, when you're identifying with villains, it's a problem. I mean, it's a real problem when you got people identifying with the villain, sympathetic to the villain, believing in the villain's cause. I mean, that really shows that, the creators really haven't learned why this bad guy is evil, why this bad guy's whole point is wrong. Because again, when it comes to superheroes, I thought that our job was to preserve human life. I thought that the job of the superhero was to go out here and do what is right for people and do what is best as related to people and show an example of good. But in today's modern comics, we're not really seeing that at all because we've been in this gray area for over, I say, about 30 years. And in that 30 years, as we've been in this gray area, we're not really seeing people present good as something positive. No, we see people going out here and putting down good, or even worse, like what I saw with Avengers Endgame, we see good basically compromising to be like evil. That was one of the things that alienated me from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and made me not want to watch any more Marvel movies was the ethics of Avengers Endgame, because when you have the heroes using time to go back and create their own Infinity Gauntlet, it basically puts them in the same place as Thanos, looking to try to be God over the universe and looking to go out here and change the universe back from where Thanos had changed it. Again, you're doing evil for evil and not showing how good takes the high road. And with X-Men 97, what they're doing is showing that, Charles Xavier looking to try to take the high road is something bad, and that the mutants have to go out here and take things to escalate them to another level to be able to deal with humanity's intolerance. I find these whole points, again, really showing how we have a real serious problem as related to creators not understanding the line of demarcation between good and evil and not understanding the ethical line a hero is supposed to take. Not understanding that there's a clear line that the good guys don't cross. And that was really shown to me early on with the MCU, with Age of Ultron, with Tony Stark looking to create the Ultron to try to protect the world from all of the aliens, basically feeling so scared about these aliens. And that basically was, again, Tony Stark's first attempt to try to play God. And it put him on a slippery slope where he basically was on this road of compromising his ethics because many of the writers really weren't thinking about the line of good and evil and thinking about how, as a hero, you have to stay on that line of good to show an example to people that you can do the right thing and still win. That was something that I was really careful about when I was writing the book, The Man Who Rules the World, where John Haynes had to deal with God Cassius, who basically had this gem of omnipotence and had incredible power and was just about to conquer the world. And John Haynes did not make any sort of compromise. He didn't make any compromise to take on God Cassius, but still eventually became victorious. And even though he had took that gem of omnipotence from God Cassius, he did not keep it. He looked to destroy it because as a hero, he wanted to maintain his integrity. And it was a major sticking point for many stories. In Conversation with Death, Death asked him why he destroyed it. And in Illuminati, they asked him why he destroyed it. But the reason why I wrote it like that is because I wanted to show that a good person is going to do what is right. They're not going to look to want to be a god over people or compromise their ethics or compromise their beliefs because they understand those principles are more important than what they call winning or losing, because the whole thing is, if you think you're going to win by compromising your ethics, what you're going to do is wind up making a compromise that costs you and costs you your soul. That's what I talk about in The Temptation of John Haynes. But when I look at modern superhero stories, I mean, we are really in a bad place ethically with these characters, because if you can sympathize with a villain, if you can sympathize with a villain's cause, I mean, there's really something wrong here. I mean, really something wrong here, because we're not supposed to see, oh, the bad guy is right. Because if you're saying that the bad guy is right and being unethical and doing all sorts of evil, I mean, that's really crossing a line. And if you cross that line, it's not a place you want to be, because as a guy who created his own universe, I could never think of writing a story where we're sympathetic to Lucifer, the devil himself, or saying Lucifer is right, or even selling a t-shirt that says Lucifer is right. I mean, if you're on the side of the bad guys, that's a red flag as I see it, because, again, you're not really understanding what ethics are or understanding what the line is, and you're basically acting on feelings. And that's what a lot of people do. They act on their feelings when they say the bad guys are right, because they're not understanding what right and wrong is. And again, just because you feel sympathetic to the bad guy, wrong is still wrong. And it's not doing right if you're going to go out here and support the bad guy's cause, because the bad guy ain't looking to do what's right for everyone. I mean, I even saw it in the movie Black Panther, a lot of people being sympathetic to Killmonger. And to me, I was shaking my head regarding Killmonger, because Killmonger was basically a commentary passive-aggressively on foundational black Americans, saying that foundational black Americans were violent and out of control and were just violent people who wanted to wage war. And we're saying sympathetically, oh, Killmonger was right to look to try to turn Wakanda into a war machine. I mean, all of these things, again, showing me we have a real problem with a lot of creators not understanding what good and evil are. And the whole point of superheroes is we want to see the good guys win, because the good guys are standing up for what's right, standing up for the right of people, the value of people, the rights of people as related to their lives. And that's where I got a problem with many of these modern comics, and I got a problem with a lot of these modern stories, because I mean, I could not ever think of writing stories where you're saying, oh, the bad guy is right, the bad guy is right in doing what he wants, and it's justified in doing what he wants. I mean, I don't, as a guy, I grew up with comics. I try to make it where you understand where the hero is standing and that the hero is standing for what's right. That's one of the reasons when I was writing John Haynes' Godbreaker, I showed with John Haynes when he said that he made an example of Thor. He made a point that if he ever looked to cross that line, I mean, he basically beats Thor almost to death, basically to prove a point to the demon Delilah that this is what happens when you go out here and look to cross the line. I mean, this is what happens when you cross the line. You basically, he feels that he's not justified to do that, because he's holding himself to the standard of God, and under the standard of God, it says, thou shalt not murder. And even though Thor threatened to kill John Haynes, he basically stood on the principles of God, showing mercy to Thor by almost beating him to death with his own hammer, basically doing this to show, yeah, this is why the good guys don't do evil, because if we do evil, then we're just as evil as the bad guys. And that's the thing that basically alienated me from Marvel Cinematic Universe movies with Avengers Endgame, because if the heroes make their own Infinity Gauntlet, then they're just as bad as Thanos and looking to be playing God. And when I see people sympathizing with Magneto, I basically see them not understanding that you're basically taking the X-Men in the same road, where they're saying, oh, we have to go out here and do this, again, as related to being as bad as the bad guys. And again, if we don't understand what the line of demarcation is as related between heroes and villains, then as I see it, there's no reason to even be invested in comics, because heroes are supposed to stand for good and stand for good throughout their stories, because a true hero looks to do what is right, even if they lose. I mean, that's what a hero does as related to showing their values and character. And if we've got a superhero world where the heroes don't have values or character, then as I see it, there's no real reason to even read these stories, because we're not reading the story of a hero looking to overcome and do what is right. No, we're just reading stories about amoral people with no real moral compass or no real moral direction. And that's the sad state of affairs that superheroes are in comics, that led to them being in a sales slump. And that's basically where the movies are right now, because of this gray area. No, people want to see heroes overcoming the odds, beating the bad guys, and standing up for what's right. And if superheroes aren't standing up for this, then I have no problem stepping away from superheroes, because to me, as a guy who writes heroes, I want to write heroes who stand up for what is good and what is right, and are willing to stand up for their integrity and stand up for their character. Because for me, what makes a hero is the internal character that they have, and that they stand up for their principles even in the face of the greatest adversity. Because we shouldn't be sympathetic to the villain. No, we should understand that yes, you're a villain and you had to go through bad things. And this is what the late Stan Lee presented, but you always have a choice. You always have a choice to do what is right, and you always have a choice to stand up for what is right. There's always a way to do what is right, and that's something I learned from Stan Lee that I take to my own stories, in showing that the hero has to stand up for what's right and do what is right. I mean, the whole thing with heroes these days is that we've lost their whole moral compass, and without that moral compass, we've got people sympathizing with bad guys who basically are promoting the ideals of evil as good. And sadly, if you promote the ideals of evil as good, then the whole principle of the superhero has basically failed, because the hero is about trying to teach the values of good to people, and that good triumphs over evil. But if the hero is just as evil as the hero, then the whole story has basically failed to teach the message that is supposed to be taught in between the pages of comic books, science fiction, and fantasy. Now, if you want to pick up books in the SJS Direct universe, you can find the books of the ISIS series, the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, and the other books of the SJS Direct universe, like those of the Spinsterella trilogy, my Black Vampire novel, Eternal Night, and other books. You can find them all in paperback and Kindle format on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them at other online booksellers like Draft to Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, and Target. And if you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can send a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS, Amari's Revenge. The goddess next door is confronted by a Nubian queen out for revenge at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this inaugural ISIS series adventure. Get your copy of ISIS Amari's Revenge in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS, Bride of Dracula. The goddess next door and John Haynes team up to take on the dark vampire in this action-packed ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, Bride of Dracula in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.